like me, are you a bit terrified by the speed and the ease with which Britain became this country?
I wouldn't say terrified, distressed and grieved, but not terrified and actually not shocked, because in several controversies in recent years where I've sort of thought that the people of this country would stand against the way in which they were being bullied and messed around, I've noticed there hasn't been all that much spirit of liberty abroad. I think there's an awful lot of conformism now in this country. People are prepared to accept being pushed around. I'm not sure parliament's been suspended exactly. It's just folded up or dissolved into a pool of blancmange. It could, if it insisted, I think, and if it had any kind of leadership, it could insist on continuing to sit, just as it could have opposed the action or indeed subjected it to anything remotely resembling scrutiny. But it just folded up and stole away in the night. And all the institutions of civil society, which are supposed to protect us, did the same thing.
Yeah.
And not a single one, not the judiciary, the human rights lot, the civil service, the media, parliament, Her Majesty's opposition, and public opinion in general simply failed to do their jobs. We demonstrated, in fact, that we don't really have a civil society any longer. And what shocked me, having spent such a long time in the old Soviet Union, of course, in the Soviet Union, it was clear that there was only one official point of view and that people were indeed being pushed around in many ways. So I don't recall them ever being compelled to stay at home. And that there was at least a pretense made of having a legislative body as well. But the point that strikes me here is that under the Soviets' rule, particularly in the Eastern European countries, but also largely in Russia, most people regarded it with a certain amount of contempt and made jokes about it and realized that they were being mocked and fooled. In this case, the population accepts what they're being told without any question. And it's extraordinary. The old USSR would love to have had a population like the current population of the Western world and the current population of the United Kingdom, which actually genuinely believes propaganda and does what it's told.
So I want to come back in a moment to that question of conformism, and particularly intellectual conformism, which I think is quite alarming, deeply alarming. But firstly, I want to just to go over the basics. You have written some very solid pieces questioning the need for this kind of shutdown. So we can come on in a moment to the question of why it's been so broadly accepted and why there is so little criticism. But let's just talk for a moment about the extraordinary situation we find ourselves in, where there is this novel new virus, which undoubtedly potentially causes great harm, especially to older people and medically vulnerable people. And in response to it, which is unprecedented in human history, we have closed down virtually the whole of society and most of the economy, and in the process stored up immeasurable problems for the future. And I think you have found it a bit of a struggle to convince people that this might not be the best way to tackle a virus.
Well, it's extraordinary, again, the willingness of people to accept something must be done, this is something, so we'll do this. The argument is, we have a problem. The way of solving it is to shut down the country and strangle civil liberty. Therefore, let's do that. There are rational responses to this. And of course, it seems to be the crucial test of any policy, and indeed of almost any human action, is not absolute right or absolute wrong. Very, very rarely it arises in practical life. It's proportionality. Is the action proportional to the problem? And you look at the past and the problems which this country and its medical system has almost every winter, for instance, with influenza and the complications of it, are considerable. I think in 1 year recently, 38,000 people died of influenza because the vaccines didn't work and it was a particularly virulent strain. The average number who die of influenza every year is, I think, 17,000 in England alone. And this does not cause the country to be shut down. It's doubtless tragic for all those involved, but you can't use emotionalism to justify a policy, especially when that policy actually means, and I have to quote here from Jonathan Sumption's interview in The World at One on Monday, because it simply hasn't been stressed enough in the coverage of what he said. They've gone on about what he said about the police, which was a marginal part of what he said. His key part was this: the real question is this serious enough to warrant putting most of our population into house imprisonment, wrecking our economy for an indefinite period, destroying businesses that honest and hard-working people have taken years to build up, saddling future generations with debt, depression, stress, heart attacks, suicides, and unbelievable distress inflicted on millions of people who are not especially vulnerable and will suffer only mild symptoms or none at all. Actually, that's exactly what I think. But I'm not a former Supreme Court judge. I'm not one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers. I'm not one of Britain's most distinguished historians. I'm not the deliverer of last year's Reith lectures. So I can say, here it is. This is a perfectly valid sentiment expressed by somebody of considerable authority and wisdom. And it isn't even reported by the media when he says it.
Yeah.
They leave it out of the reports of what he says because no one's prepared to confront this. There's the omertà, the total supine consensus over this matter. The complete failure to debate it is astonishing to me. And it's the lack of proportion that he's stressing there. Even if this were an effective policy, could it possibly be justified given the disastrous results? And the other point, which I have to say is raised by the extraordinary Professor Siegfried Bachti of Mainz University in Germany, an absolute genius in microbiological medicine who's utterly against these measures. He said, what about the healthy old, now deprived of all the things that make life worth living? He reckons that this shutting down of their lives will be catastrophic and almost certainly cause large numbers of deaths. So you can't just say, oh, you don't care about people dying. That's not what the argument is. I care about people dying unnecessarily as much as anybody else, and my motives are as good as anybody else's. It's just my motives are also driven by more intelligent thought, more reason, and a better grasp of the facts.
I think Sumption's intervention was very useful for a number of reasons, but one of them is what you've just touched upon there, which is this really poisonous accusation that has been made against anyone who criticizes the shutdown of society, which is you don't care about old people, or even you want old people to die. And
it's the same as in the Iraq War. If you said, actually, this war is war, oh, so you support Saddam Hussein's fascist regime, do you? You believe in that Saddam should be allowed to torture people, do you? That's the sort of person you are you? And that the shutting down by spite and lies, a serious debate on a major matter. I think this should probably be called VMD, the virus of mass destruction. It is so very similar in the way in which it propagandizes and the way in which it tries to crush dissent.
I want to talk about what seems to me like a relish for dystopia. There's almost a perverse glee some people are taking in the newly authoritarian nation we find ourselves in. And the thing that, and we touched upon this at the start of the discussion, the thing that I find, you're not particularly shocked by this, but it's certainly alarming, which is almost the welcoming of authoritarianism that has taken place in certain sections of society, the desire to be told what to do, the desire to be ruled, the desire to be instructed by a deputy chief medical officer none of us ever voted for about how long we must stay under house arrest, when we're allowed to go out, and when this might finally be eased. And my instinct, and I'm sure other people's instinct, is to bristle at this and say, well, who the hell are you to tell us to do these things or not do those things? But we have to accept that there is a welcoming attitude to that authoritarianism among certain sections of society. What do you think drives that kind of voluntarily living under a dictatorship?
People haven't been brought up to be free, I think. I've said for a long time, and I think I pinched some of this from Neil Postman's work on amusing ourselves to death, but I think electronic media do tend to make people more conformist. They offer an idea of life, which means there is one sense of humor, there is one point of view, there is one way to look, there's one way to talk, which is very, very powerful on the young. I was brought up in a country which had long ago ceased to exist, in which we were brought up to be proud to be free. And to be proud that our policemen were unarmed, and to be proud that an Englishman's home was his castle, and to be proud that nobody could arrest us for what we said. And it was genuine. My generation still felt that. But I remember there's a change in the teaching of history, which took place while I was still at school, the taking away of all the old history books with the stories about the glorious revolution and the petition of right, all the rest of it, being replaced by modern ones. And I fortunately had already absorbed the message of the old before the new ones came in, but most people haven't. And anyone who has studied history, of course, Lord Sumption is a historian, will recognize here the classic symptoms of collective hysteria. Hysteria is infectious. We are working ourselves up into a lather in which we exaggerate the threat and stop asking ourselves whether the cure may be worse than the disease. And I think that's an absolutely correct analysis. It is hysteria. And people who've looked at the history of other countries and wondered how it is that those crowds surge into the street to applaud those appalling people. Now you know. This is how it happens. People want to love Big Brother.
On the lack of love for freedom, which I think is one of the most worrying things that's coming through in this process. Do you think there is some hope in the kind of... There have been a few flashpoints over the past week or so, particularly with what people view as excessive policing, like Derbyshire police filming people from the sky, roadblocks being set up, people being told not to buy Easter eggs because it's, apparently it's not essential to buy those kinds of things. There is a bristling. Part of me worries that the bristling is only against the most ridiculous, ludicrous examples of this rather than against the whole thing itself. But does that give you a glimmer of hope that sometime in the next few weeks people are going to start asking questions about this new nation we find ourselves in?
Well, perhaps so. Again, Lord Sumption's intervention has made a considerable difference, I think, and it's probably softened it quite a bit until he spoke. And it was interesting that he actually wrote his initial article in the Times 8 days ago, and it took nearly a week for the BBC even to notice. The Times itself buried it on page 94, actually 54, which is nearly the same. Given that he has spoken as he has, I think the police will probably restrain themselves. There were times when I thought, as I set out on a walk or a bicycle ride, I thought, well, what if I am actually run in for taking too much exercise? And there is no limit to this. It's perfectly possible that someone will decide that what I'm doing is wrong and slap a fine on me. What do I do then? Do I appeal to the Bill of Rights of 1689? And there's such officiousness. There's a lovely riverside pub not far from where I live, which I bicycled past the other evening, and it has some tables and chairs outside it on the riverbank. And to prevent people from sitting there, they've stretched plastic tape over the net.
God.
Of course, if you want to sit down in the countryside, there still remain tree trunks and farm gates and all kinds of other things where you can do it. But this level of officiousness, I saw people going around putting skips in the entrances of car parks and beauty spots to prevent people driving. So it's extraordinary, the energy which a police force finds to do these things, which it didn't ever seem to be able to find in pursuing burglars or many other criminals who people were worried about before all this got underway.
The intellectual conformism is quite chilling, and as you know, and others of us know, anyone who raises any questions whatsoever about the lockdown is just vilified beyond belief, completely demonized, and there are attempts to shame you into silence if you raise questions. But at a time like this, surely dissent and questioning and intellectual curiosity become even more important than they normally are, but they seem to be flagging very, very badly right now.
Dissent is a moral duty. If you believe that something is wrong, it's a moral duty. In any case, there is no polity ever devised by man which cannot be improved by being debated and which cannot be improved by being exposed to opposition.
Do you think it will take a while for Britain to recover, not from the virus, which is another issue entirely in a sense, but I think it will take a while for us to recover from this very quick transformation of the country into a pretty unpleasant, atomized place where, the police are inundated with calls apparently from people who saw their neighbours going for a second jog, or as you say, even to nod your head at someone now or say hello is treated as a kind of possible, spread of plague. It seems to me that we are creating a culture, or we have consented to the creation of a culture that it could take a bit of a while to shake off once this is passed, if it passes.
I don't think we'll ever recover from it. I think it's like those terrible moments that most of us have had in life where we failed in some test. You never come back. That part of you is lost. And that part of the country, the civil courage of the country, seems to me, is lost. And the government know that it is lost. And those in authority know that it is lost. Giving way to me, for instance, to the actual closing and locking of churches so I can no longer practice my own religion. It hasn't happened in this country since the days of King John, and even he allowed baptisms. It's humiliating to me to communicate, particularly with American friends, and say, this is what has happened to the country of Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights and habeas corpus. We are actually supine under the stern gaze of the supposedly benevolent state. And once you've done that, once you've gone under the yoke and subjected yourself to this sort of authority, there's nothing, you've lost virtue, which means you will never, ever be able to stand up again to it.